And now it is my pleasure to announce to you and introduce to you Max Harms, a friend and fellow organizer for Columbus Rationality. He's been instrumental in the Ohio rationality community in other parts of the state as well, is very passionate about how we can understand the way that we think and to think better. Is also not afraid of conflict, so if you do have any disagreements, don't be afraid to voice those and take part in that discussion at the end of the program. Please join me in giving Max a warm welcome.
Oh, thank you very much. So my talk is on cryonics. And cryonics is the preservation of people by reducing their temperature with the hopes that if a person is injured or dying, that they can be revived at some point in the future where the technology to do so exists. Oh yeah, please get the light. Thank you. Okay, so I'd like to start with a quote, which is often misattributed to C.S. Lewis. It's the other one. You don't have a soul. You are a soul, you have a body, by George MacDonald. The concept of souls is universal across the world, and we see them illustrated in stories about ghosts and death, a soul without a body, living on after the body has passed away. This sorts of thinking is so universal that children, even children raised in secular households and who are intelligent and otherwise non-indoctrinated, when told stories about animals and asked after an animal has died what the animal is feeling, will still come up with explanations as to what the experiences of that animal is, right? Or what the experiences of a person is after that person has died. We are wired to be dualists, to think in terms of a body and a soul. So I want you to think for a second about what it would be like to be dead. And this is an interesting question because from a certain perspective, I see this as what is the experience of a person that does not exist? Like, death is the removal of the person. So if you remove the person, what does it experience? It's a question sort of like, if I burn a piece of paper, is that paper folded or unfolded? It's a non-question. There is no state for the person that does not exist. Now note that there's an assumption going on here, and it's an assumption which disagrees with standard theistic thinking. A standard theistic thinking says that when the body dies, the person remains as the soul. This is the whole concept behind dualism. We say that death is the destruction of the person, but the theist says death is the destruction of the body. There's a disconnect between what we're talking about with regards to the concepts involved. So we have to think about what death actually means. Okay? From my perspective, death of the body while the soul persists is not a real death. When I'm afraid of dying, I'm not afraid of my body going away while my consciousness and my experiences do other things. I'm not mourning the passing of a person to another place where they have eternal joy. No, I'm mourning the absence of the person, the loss of the person. Death is real. By the time it takes me to say this sentence, 15 people will have died. And I am of the position that these people are gone. They aren't in heaven. They don't persist as ghosts wandering the earth. They are gone, period. But how do we know that death is real? How do we know that theists are wrong? How do we know that when a body dies, the soul also dies? So the first principle is Occam's razor. When the body dies, it looks like the person is just gone. To postulate this afterlife, where people continue to exist, is to add on additional complexity that's not based in evidence. But we don't even have to refer to Occam's razor when talking about why we know death is false, because science lets us understand what a person is. We say death is the non-existence of the person rather than the body. Well, what is a person? Once upon a time, we were dualists in science, and the idea was that you have a body and then there's a soul and there's this interaction between the two. If I were to cut off your arm, I would not have harmed your soul. I would have harmed your body, but your soul would still be intact. I wouldn't have touched the person part. I would have only touched the meat part, the bones, etc. There's a kind of logic to this, right? If I bleed you a little bit, you're still the same person as you were before. The personhoodness is not connected to the body in most cases. The exception to this is the brain. So in the recent decades, we've gained an increasingly clear picture of the way in which we can poke and prod at not just meat parts, but person parts by touching the brain. We say, this is where your affinity for classical music comes from. This is your memory of being 4 years old. It's in there. There's nothing about a person that a sufficiently advanced or accurate scalpel or collection of chemicals couldn't change. So this leads us to a revision of that quote. You don't have a brain. You are a brain, and you have a body. So this means that any change I make to your brain should be a change to you. But that's wrong. This molecule is called semi-heavy water. It's basically identical to water, except one of the hydrogens has an extra neutron attached. It becomes deuterium. Semi-heavy water has many of the same properties as water. It's just a tiny bit more massive. So if I replaced all of your brain's water, and your brain is mostly water, with semi-heavy water, it would make a change. It would be 56 grams heavier. We could measure that change. But would it be a change to you if I did that? You would think the same sort of thoughts. The chemical properties of your brain, the ideas and dreams and memories would still be there. So the change to the brain would not be the change to the person. The person is contained in the thoughts, the feelings, the desires, the memories, the skills, the hopes, whatever. If I don't change those, to what degree can I be said to be changing the person? This principle, this assumption, this idea, is the fundamental idea behind the philosophy of functionalism. Functionalism says that we ought to think of people as information, as being the products of the ideas, regardless of where those ideas happen to be or whether or not they're made of water or semi-heavy water. The concept of functionalism allows for a lot of complexity. By removing the soul and replacing it with a pattern, we have the ability to change the pattern without completely invalidating it. A person who has had their classical music taste replaced with rap tastes, they're mostly the same person. They're very close to the same person. Whereas, if I take two different minds and I compare the patterns, those are going to be very different patterns. This room for complexity is very important. You should generally seek this when looking for a model. So now we can replace that opening quote with my preferred version. You don't have a pattern, you are a pattern, and you have a substrate, whatever that substrate happens to be. Functionalists like to think of people like stories. This is the opening to Alice in Wonderland. Okay? One copy of Alice in Wonderland is the same story as another copy of Alice in Wonderland. It could be a different book, different pages, different font, different ink, different text, different pictures, but the story is still the same. From my perspective, it's important to think about the informational content. The story is the information, a person is the information. Now, this talk is about cryonics. You haven't come to the wrong place. But from my perspective, functionalism is the foundation of cryonics. It's the underpinning. You don't have to agree with functionalism in order to get something out of this talk, but you should understand where I'm coming from as a functionalist and where a lot of cryonicists are coming from as functionalists. So, to a functionalist, we ask the question, what is death? And there are multiple answers to this, but the answer that I'm going to use for this talk, the assumption that I'm going to give, is death is information loss. If a person is the pattern of their thoughts, memories, feelings, all that stuff, then death is what happens when that information is removed from the universe, from the possible retrieval. This is the same opening to Alice in Wonderland. We can imagine it getting wiped. This is a one-way, basically a one-way process. Once you've erased it, it's gone, which resonates with my intuition that death should be a final thing that occurs. There are other concepts of death. Make sure that whatever concept you're using of death, you are consistent about applying. And if you apply a concept of death that is reversible in principle, that you remember that it's reversible. Okay, so the concept of death as information loss also allows for this range of complexity. We see, imagine taking Alice in Wonderland and removing the first chapter. Most of the story remains. This allows for half-death, or parts of death. From a more human angle, imagine you could get amnesia and you lose a lot of your memories. From the functionalist information theoretic perspective, part of you has died. Most of you still is alive, but there is a way in which you have died, and that's worthy of mourning or something along those lines. Okay, so enough philosophy. Let's talk about cryonics. This guy is the North American wood frog. Every winter, he freezes solid. Totally solid. No breathing, no heart rate, no synaptic firing. The brain shuts down, the metabolism shuts down, sub-zero temperatures. From a clinical perspective, this frog is dead. From an information theoretic perspective, from a functionalist perspective, the frog is still alive. The information of the frog's neurons is still intact. As long as it's frozen, it's okay. And lo and behold, in the spring, it thaws, ta-da, it's back to good old standard frog life, whatever that happens to be. The North American wood frog is unique in that it has evolved to specifically and intentionally freeze. But there are lots of other organisms which can be reduced to sub-zero temperatures and survive. Most of these organisms are single-celled organisms or are otherwise very small. These bacteria are from one of the earlier ice ages and were restored from ice after 100,000 years and are, alive, or were at the time that that photo was taken. Water bears, this is an embryo. Lots of living human cells are successfully frozen and revived on a small scale. And there have even been examples of lobsters being reduced down to sub-zero temperatures and being restored to animation. From an information theoretic perspective, none of these animals or organisms died. Their DNA was still intact. The parts of them that were important were still intact during the freezing process. The question is whether or not they were animate or inanimate. So in 2005, University of Pittsburgh, there was a study where they took a bunch of dogs and they bled the dogs out, and as they did so, they reduced the body temperatures of the dogs to just above freezing, just not quite to the sub-zero temperatures, but reduced them very low. These dogs were dead, clinically dead, but not dead from an information theoretic perspective. Okay? Their brains were still intact, and they were this way for 3 full hours, lying on the table, not breathing. After having their body temperatures raised and the blood put back in their systems, these dogs came back to life as zombie dogs. They reanimated. They ceased to be cold. And these dogs, most of these dogs, lived and were otherwise unaffected by this process, not significantly harmed. How can this be? The brain is such a fragile thing. If you don't think that the brain is fragile, try holding your breath. Your brain needs oxygen. 3 minutes without oxygen, you'll start to see brain damage start to set in, right? You'll pass out. Only a few hours without oxygen is required for your brain to essentially turn to mush. But these dogs survived 3 hours without breathing, without oxygen. Their brains were protected by the cold. It was only because the temperature of the dogs was reduced that the dogs survived. The principle here is metabolism. The reason the brain needs oxygen is that there's a number of metabolic processes that are occurring in the brain that require oxygen to keep working. Imagine it like a machine where you need oxygen as part of the process. Without the oxygen, the machines start falling apart. They grind themselves up. Okay? This is why you have to chill them down, because cold slows the process. It slows down metabolism. So the processes which would normally grind the cells up and turn them into mush are slowed down, and the absence of oxygen is no longer a problem because the machinery isn't working. Clinical death, the sort of thing where, on the operating table, time of death is not the actual time when people die. Your brain is still largely intact. And remember, death is a spectrum, right? So 3 minutes without oxygen, you're going to start to see negative effects. But there's still much of the person that is still alive when clinical death is called. With the right technology, people who are clinically dead can be brought back to life. And we see this in many cases, right? Where people had I was dead, but then I came back to life, and isn't it a miracle? No, you were never dead. The information was still there. What happened is you stopped breathing, and that's a fixable problem. So, heat is dangerous. Heat is the enemy. Heat is about motion and change. Your body needs heat in order to work, but when your body stops working, all the heat does is contribute to its decay and the rate at which it collapses. The cold means all the machinery of the body slows down. And again, the metaphor of the machine, right? It just slows the machine down. So any damaged processes are held static. You don't have the opportunity to decay because you're cold. Cold is good, but lots of people die from exposure. Why do people die from exposure? Why is it generally not a good idea to just go and freeze yourself solid during the winter like the North American wood frog? Problem is this stuff. Our bodies are mostly water, as I mentioned, right? And water has an unfortunate property of changing from a nice, smooth liquid into a crystalline solid at 0 degrees. And in cells, this does all sorts of nasty things. In most tissues, what happens is ice crystals form in the gaps between cells because there's less salt there. And as it does so, it continues to draw more and more water outside of the cells until the cells become so desiccated that they actually implode. But ice is generally bad. The North American wood frog survives because it manages ice. It's not the cold that's the problem, it's the ice that's the problem. When it goes into hibernation, the frog draws the water of its body into special sacs where, if ice crystals form, it won't damage the tissues. The rest of the tissues are pumped full of a sugar-based solution that, when it's reduced in temperature, it doesn't freeze. So the brain and the heart and the lungs and all the important organs for the frog, even though they're at a reduced temperature below 0, haven't frozen. The frog is encoded in ice, but it's still not frozen itself. It's vitrified. That's the term we use in cryonics for something that's reduced to a sub-zero temperature without being frozen. Cold is good from a medical perspective. If there was no ice, you could be reduced down in temperature and brought back in temperature without significant complication. Ice is bad. And the technology of cryonics is largely about trying to manage ice. It's trying to reduce people in temperature without having them freeze. To do this, a technology based on the same sort of thing as the wood frog is employed. A sugar-based solution is injected in the place of people's blood, like with the dogs, and this solution gets pushed into the cells, pushes the water out of the cells. This is actually very bad because your cells need water. But it does accomplish the goal of reducing ice crystal formation in tissues. People who are properly vitrified do not have significant tissue damage from ice. or at least, to varying degrees of significance. Though there are definitely unsolved problems. Cryonics is not a proven technology. We have never seen a mammal reduced to sub-zero temperatures, much less a human, and brought back to full animation. Okay? The primary problem is, what do you do with the cryoprotectant, with the solution that you've used to replace the person's blood? How do you get that out of the body and get the temperature raised back up without, serious problems? It's especially hard because at the point where you're trying to get the solution out of the body, it's really cold, which prevents circulation from occurring. Now, just because there are unsolved problems does not mean these problems will not be solved. These are technical problems. And the people who understand these technical problems think that cryonics is legitimate. There are no white papers or journal articles describing how cryonics won't work. All experts in the field who understand the process think that it is possible, and it is a matter of overcoming the technical problems. And most of the people who comment, at least, in the scientific sphere on cryonics believe that these technologies are not way, way distant future technologies, but are actually solvable technologies which we can potentially see in the next 100 years or so. Most of the criticism of cryonics comes from what it resembles, right? Oh, it's unnatural. It's pseudoscience. You're playing God. That sounds like science fiction. Death makes life meaningful. How dare you, blah, 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 okay? Cryonics doesn't sound normal. It doesn't seem like, oh, I'm just going to go get my head frozen, right, vitrified, right? Like, people will look at you like, what are you doing? And it is the state of normal affairs to base our ideas not off of the logical consequences and the theoretical basis, but purely off of resemblance and pattern matching. It is one of the principal ideas of rationality to take ideas seriously by considering what their consequences are, and rather than criticizing them based on what they resemble or what their conclusions might mean for your theology or something along those lines. Okay, so this is the dream of the cryonics patient. You get told that you have stage 4 cancer and that you're dying. They anesthetize you, and then you go to sleep and you wake up in some future where cancer's not such a problem, and they've figured out how to revive you from low temperatures, and who knows what sort of machines or technologies or fantastic things might happen in that time, right? All the process of dying and stuff, like, it's just going to sleep, all right? Now, what your vision of the future looks like depends on who you ask. I am personally more convinced by an idea of maybe my brain gets scanned rather than having to go and take all the chemicals out and get it warmed up in just the right way. Why not just put it under a scanner? That we have brain scanners right now, and the technology is getting better. Once you have a scan of the pattern, again, the pattern is the person, so the person would exist in the computer, and who knows, maybe I'd wake up in some sort of computer world like Tron or something along those lines. So this all sounds like science fiction, and it sounds like science fiction even to me. But it's important to remember that once upon a time, this sounded like science fiction. All technologies sound like science fiction before you see them work. This is the fundamental barrier to technological progress, is that, well, I've never seen that happen before, so it's probably not going to work. And some technologies don't work, but some technologies do. And it's important to remember that just because something sounds far-fetched doesn't mean it actually is. You have to evaluate the physical principles behind it. So I plan on being cryopreserved, but you might not. Maybe one life is good enough for you. You only want to live 80 years, whatever. I'm not here to convince you to sign up for cryonics. What you personally do is up to you. The goal of this talk is to tell you that cryonics as a community as we are a community, needs to be taken seriously. It needs to be supported and endorsed as an option. Cryonics right now costs between $30,000 and $200,000 per person, which, if you're like me, sounds like an awful lot of money. Like, oh gosh. There are some things where that might make this actually less money than it feels like initially. Most people pay for cryonics with life insurance. So if you're young, you can buy a life insurance policy and pay for your end-of-life care, whatever, vitrification, over the course of your lifetime, over the years. And the price then is actually fairly reasonable. But more importantly, to the cryonics patient, cryonics is an alternative to risky or otherwise uncertain medical treatment towards the end of life. If you're diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, you can spend $30,000 trying to fight it and eke out, maybe another 6 months of life, year of life. You might beat it too, right? But there's a way in which we can see the end coming. And the end will come if you don't have the technology to fight it. And we don't have the technology to fight it right now, aside from potentially preserving ourselves. So someone who is interested in cryonics has the opportunity to skip trying to extend their life in the fragile end of life moments, and instead sign up for cryonics. And if compared with the cost of dealing with heavy illness and that sort of stuff, cryonics is actually very competitive. The US has a healthcare problem. We spend way more on healthcare than most of the rest of the world. Most of the people who spend more on healthcare in the US are the elderly. And I can understand why. You want to live longer, okay? But if an elderly person says, all right, I can spend $40,000 times 10 years, maybe, make $400,000 to live this fragile life that's not nearly so good as I was when I was younger. That $400,000 could go elsewhere. If people are interested in spending their money on cryonics rather than on costly medical care towards the end of their life, the point is you should let them. We should endorse this as a community. But let's talk about something worse than just this. Let's talk about Alzheimer's. Because from a functionalist perspective, Alzheimer's is dying before your body has died. Your mind goes, then your body goes. From the time Alzheimer's sets in, it takes 8 to 20 years for your body to finally collapse. During this time, you will slowly be chipped away, memory by memory, personality trait by personality trait, until your body is finally dead and you're allowed to be buried. Okay? This is like terrifying. I would hate to have done this. Not just for the personal experience, okay? I mean, that would be awful, but my family would have to watch me die slowly, and they would have to pay huge amounts of money to take care of me as I collapsed, all right? The huge amounts of money comparable to taking care of Alzheimer's patients who are dying, and nobody thinks there's, really a good chance of saving them. Even if there was a cure for Alzheimer's, it would be an early stage cure. The information that's lost is lost. Compared to that, cryonics is awesome. Cryonics is hope. Cryonics is not having to watch people die, and cryonics is cheaper. Okay? Cryonics is also illegal in these cases. The reason cryonics is illegal is because suicide is illegal. And from the perspective of the state, the person is still alive. If they can breathe and their heart beats, then no, you can't freeze them yet, right? Because that would be killing them, removing their vital function, okay? From a functionalist perspective, this is nonsense, and you're killing them by not allowing them to do cryonics. As a community, this is why this is a humanist imperative, because humanists have the potential to think that this is actually happening, that these people are dying and they don't have to be dying. Okay? Theists see the person as still being untouched. Their souls are going to go to heaven. Ooh, yeah. Right? Suicide is still illegal. Suicide is still a sin, rather, from a Judeo-Christian standpoint. And it's God's plan that you get Alzheimer's, blah, blah, blah. Theists are very keen to criticize cryonics as playing God or going against God's will, et cetera, et cetera. And so the humanist community has the opportunity to be a vanguard in supporting cryonics as an alternative to dying slow and painful deaths. People right now are dying, right? They're dying at a staggering rate. And I wish I could save them all. I can't save them all, okay? But we might be able to save some of them. Some people have the resources to try and preserve themselves. And we should let them do so because it's actually in our economic benefit and morally reprehensible to oppose it. The cryonics scales really well. It's because of the physics of keeping cold. You only have to chill the edges of a container in order to keep it cold, so you have a nice multiplicative scaling. I've heard the figure that if everyone in the world was by default assumed to be cryopreserved, it would only cost 50 cents per year to preserve someone in stasis. So I don't know about you, but I would really definitely pay 50 cents per year to prevent the death of a loved one, even if they were in suspended animation and not available for hangouts. All technology sounds like science fiction at first. The goal is to take it seriously, do the math, think about the science, figure out what experts say, listen to that, and then ultimately we need to change the way our society thinks about death and thinks about things like suicide and thinks about things like Alzheimer's. We can change for the better. And because I probably haven't convinced some of you that the cryonics is a likely thing to work, you're going to have to do the math, but I've done some math. There's handouts which have references, and I've also included this on the handouts. Feel free to talk to me about the utility calculations. My ballpark estimate is that cryostasis in 2015 is worth approximately $272 billion to me, which is a lot of money. So that might be wrong, but even if I'm off by several orders of magnitude, it would still be the right choice. That's it. Thank you.